Welcome to the final part of this lecture, which is the neuromuscular transmission. The neuromuscular transmission is actually the physiological process at which the transmission of information occurs from the motor neuron to the muscles. Now, when we talk about the neuromuscular transmission, the site or the place where the process occurs is called the neuromuscular junction. So this is quite similar to the chemical synapse that we learned earlier. So in neuromuscular junction, rather than having presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron, in this neuromuscular junction we actually have the motor neuron, which is equivalent to the presynaptic neuron, and the motor end plate, which is equivalent to the postsynaptic neuron. The other things are quite the same. Okay, so in the motor neuron, you will have the voltage-gated calcium channel, the synaptic vesicles containing the neurotransmitter, and also the mitochondria. Now, these synaptic vesicles in the motor neuron, it contains only one type of neurotransmitter, which is the acetylcholine. And there's also the synaptic cleft, which is the junction in between the two, and then we have the motor end plate. Now, this motor end plate is actually part of the muscles. So if you can imagine that this neuromuscular junction, it can be found in any types of muscles. It can be in the skeletal muscle, it can be in cardiac muscles, and it also can be found in the smooth muscles as well. On the motor end plate, of course, we have the receptor as well, but this time it is more specific compared to the chemical synapse. The receptor on the motor end plate is known as the nicotinic receptor. Nicotinic receptor. Okay, if you read the textbook, you will see that the acetylcholine, it can bind to two types of receptor, which is nicotinic or muscarinic. But specifically in the neuromuscular junction, the name of the receptor in which the acetylcholine bind is the nicotinic, and usually it is denoted as this NACH receptor. You also need to know, okay, that the neuromuscular junction is actually the junction with the terminal axon of the motor neuron with the muscles fiber. Now, if we zoom out and we look at the whole of the motor neuron, okay, this motor neuron together with all of the skeletal muscles that it innervates, okay, because the terminal the axon will actually branches out to form a number of terminal axon. So the whole structure here is what we call as the motor unit. Okay, the motor unit. Now, let's look at the events that occur during the neuromuscular transmission. So it's quite similar to chemical synapse. So first, we have the action potential arriving in the motor neuron, and then it causes depolarization of the motor neuron motor neuron terminal axon. Yes, motor neuron terminal axon, which eventually will then stimulates the opening of the voltage-gated calcium channel. Now, after that, the calcium will then move into the cell down the concentration gradient, okay, and then it will cause an increase in the intracellular calcium concentration. Next, the increase in the intracellular calcium concentration will then causes the fusion of the synaptic vesicles with the plasma membrane and the release of the neurotransmitter, which is the acetylcholine. Now, this acetylcholine will then travel across the synaptic cleft. Eventually, it will then bind onto the nicotinic receptor. Now, the nicotinic receptor is an ionotropic receptor. Ionotropic receptor, which means that it is whenever the acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptor, it opens the sodium channel, and then the sodium will move into the cell, and it causes the depolarization of the motor end plate. Now, when the depolarization hits the threshold, then it will then fire an action potential. The next additional step is that this acetylcholine Okay, this acetylcholine, once it causes the depolarization, it will be degraded. Okay, it will be degraded by the enzyme known as the acetylcholinesterase. So if we recall back what happened to the acetylcholine is that it will be degraded into acetate and choline by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Now this choline will then be reuptake back into the presynaptic neuron by the sodium choline cotransporter. Okay, so I expect all of you to know this event. Now we talked earlier about the factors affecting the synaptic transmission. Now let's look at the factors affecting the neuromuscular transmission. Okay, so this time I would like to classify the factors affecting the neuromuscular transmission according to the steps of the events where it occurs. So the first step is that can be affected is the opening of the voltage gated calcium channel. Okay, opening of the voltage gated calcium channel. In a disease known as a Lambert-Eaton myasthenia syndrome, it is an autoimmune disease where there is antibody against this voltage gated calcium channel. So you can imagine these channels, okay, it should open when there is depolarization, but if there is antibody that binds to it, it stops the voltage gated calcium channel from opening. Therefore, you won't have depolarization and release of neurotransmitter from the motor neuron. So this is where it affects. Now the second one is that the release of the acetylcholine via exocytosis. Okay, the release of acetylcholine via the via the exocytosis. Remember we talked in the chemical synapse we have the Clostridium tetani, which inhibits GABA release, whereas we have the botulinum toxin that inhibits the acetylcholine release. So similarly, this botulinum toxin can also affect the acetylcholine released from the motor neuron. Another toxin that acts similarly is the beta-bungarotoxin. Now, there's also another one which is known as alpha-laterotoxin. This is usually secreted by the black widow spider venom. What happens is that instead of inhibiting the acetylcholine release, it actually promotes the acetylcholine release, but it promotes the acetylcholine release too much until at one point there will be no acetylcholine storage left in the presynaptic neuron, leading to depletion. Therefore, you can imagine initially if there is a toxication with the black widow spider venom, initially it can cause spasm, but later on it can cause paralysis because there is depletion of the acetylcholine. Now, the next step that can be affected is the binding of the acetylcholine to the nicotinic receptors. Now, binding of acetylcholine to the nicotinic receptors can be affected by two condition or two disease. First is the curare. Curare is a toxin, and again another neurotoxin. And second, a disease known as myasthenia gravis. Now, myasthenia gravis is quite similar to Lambert-Eaton myasthenia syndrome, in which it is an autoimmune disease and there is an antibody, but this time this antibody will inhibit the nicotinic receptor. Okay. And similarly, the curare can also act as a competitive inhibitor to the nicotinic receptor. Number 4, the fourth step that can be affected is the degradation of acetylcholine by acetylcholinesterase. And this can be done by the neurotoxin neostigmine and organophosphate. Now, Organophosphate is usually found in the pesticides, and that is why there's quite a strict regulation in which certain pesticides that contain organophosphate classically were used by the farmers have been legally prohibited to be used nowadays. You can imagine that if you have this thing stopping the degradation of the acetylcholine, the acetylcholine will kind of stay on the nicotinic receptor all the time. Okay, and what happens is that the neuromuscular transmission will be enhanced rather than inhibited initially. And finally, the step that can be affected is the reuptake of the acetate into the motor neuron, and this process can be inhibited by another chemicals known as the hemicolinium. Therefore, if in this state, what happens is that the motor neuron will be depleted of acetylcholine. We won't be resynthesize the acetylcholine. So those are all the factors affecting the neuromuscular transmission. Thank you very much.